Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us on this discussion on weed science and research. We're going to let the webinar fill for just a couple of seconds here, and then we'll get everything kicked off. Again, thanks everybody for joining us this afternoon. We're going to wait about another minute for the web room to fill, and we'll get started.
You see my slides and hear me?
Sure can. Dr. Culpepper, if you'd like to get us started, I think we're good to go.
Hello again, everyone. Welcome to the fourth session of the WSSA and the USDA ARS. My name is Stanley Culpepper, and I want to welcome you to this session, and we appreciate your attending. And I'm going to turn it over to our moderator, Dr. Stephen Young. Steve?
Yeah, thanks, Stanley. Appreciate that. So again, welcome everybody to the Weed Science webinar series. And if you've tuned in previously, we've talked about a number of topics under the theme of tactics. So the past couple of webinars, we've talked about biocontrol, integrated weed management. And today we're going to finish up that theme of this series, and we're going to talk about new technology. So we have got an individual here with us, a weed scientist at with ARS. So Dr. Stephen Mirsky is a research ecologist in the Sustainable Agricultural Systems Laboratory at the Beltsville Agricultural Research Center in Beltsville, Maryland. He's quantifying how management climate and soils interact to impact crop and weed performance with the goal of merging precision and sustainable agricultural practices. He accomplishes these goals by assembling transdisciplinary research and outreach teams that include partnering with farmers, commodity boards, and industry. He's helped to found and co-lead GROW, the acronym for Getting Rid of Weeds, a national public research and extension integrated weed management network. Stephen is part of a team developing an open access national weed image repository and low-cost weed species and biomass mapping technologies. This work includes developing web-based decision support tools for agricultural professionals and farmers for real-time decision-making and long-term planning. Today, he's going to talk about the National Integrated Weed Management Team, GROW, and their contributions to herbicide-resistant weed management for researchers, farmers, and agricultural professionals. So before I turn it over to Dr. Mirsky, I want to also remind folks that we will be able to answer questions at the end, so hang tight. I'm sure we're going to have some time for Q&A, so be sure to get your questions down. You can actually use the chat if you'd like, or the Q&A, either one. And we'll try to get those to answer those at the end. So without any further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Stephen. So go ahead and let's hear what you've got to share with us.
Thanks, Steve. I appreciate it. And thanks for inviting me to participate in this event, this webinar series. I do want to mention that my abstract was a little bit lacking, and that what it should have also included is that this is really meant to be a presentation that features sort of digital weeds work within ARS as a whole. And so there's a number of other ARS scientists' work that is going to be featured in this presentation. I'll be sort of starting off with some of the work that I'm involved in, just because there's a number of folks that are involved, and it also provides an opportunity to sort of give some specifics about what goes into computer vision and AI around species identification and mapping of weeds. And then I'll sort of close with giving some examples of researchers in ARS that are also doing this work in various different types of applications. So again, thank you for the opportunity. Couldn't help but not showcase this incredible video content that came out of Blue River and John Deere on, precision weed management. This just sort of, cultivates the imagination on what is possible going forward. And I think that that's really the take-home message here from my talk, is that computer vision and AI, high performance computing capabilities on the edge, this is sort of transforming what is possible. Particularly weed science, I think, is one of the disciplines that are just so dramatically impacted by these technology advancements. We can, from a research perspective, we can now, measure and monitor individual plants in a field. That's just kind of mind-blowing, right? I mean, all of us in weed science have been spending our careers trying to figure out, the most parsimonious way to count weeds, get on our hands and knees, count weeds, cut weeds, identify them, measure them, weigh them, all that jazz. And it's tedious, it's slow, and it's imperfect, right? Because weeds are very heterogeneous in fields. They're in patches. So you can be, you can be measuring and monitoring areas of a research plot or a field that has very low weed dynamics in them, weed presence, and areas that have high populations. So the ability to sort of now measure at the individual plant level, estimate biomass, quantify fecundity, it's sort of just a game changer for research and about enabling us to really advance what is possible within the discipline. From a farming perspective, this is also, providing all sorts of opportunities for growers for, near to real-time decision-making, as well as long-term planning about their fields and having much higher resolution knowledge about what's going on in those fields. And I think what's really exciting is sort of, we're one of the disciplines that's seeing some of the most integration with engineers, right? I think that sort of a lot of the disciplines are sort of, operating in silos, but you see a really strong interaction between the engineers and weed scientists that really create sort of this next level applications for the discipline, and producing the next generation of scientists that are sort of these hybrid applied scientists with these types of skill sets. So really excited about the future. All right, maybe we'll advance the slide here. So here's just to make the point that, it's not a novelty. This is not something that's coming in the future down the road. The robots are here, right? This is sort of the future of weed science, whether it's tractor mounted technologies that like Blue River is developing with their, precision spray applicators, to these, smaller, more versatile types of robots that I'm featuring here. This is where the discipline and this is where the industry is going, and it's really here at this point. So I'm going to feature GROW, which is a team I'm pretty excited about. It's a national integrated weed management team that ARS had the foresight to fund and help establish this sort of national network that's focused around integrated weed management. A heavy emphasis is on technology transfer, extension, and outreach. If you go to our website, you can see that this is sort of a one-stop shop for integrated weed management solutions, and it's continuously expanding. The resources are rich in this team as far as sort of that extension outreach focus, and you'll see more and more content coming online. And just a shout out to a number of our key leaders like Michael Flessner and Mark Van Gessel, who've been key leaders in that activity, but a lot of folks have been generating a ton of content with that team. Anyway, so GROW as a whole also does a lot of common experiments, on-station, on-farm research, focus around multi-tactic weed management. And what I'm going to do is showcase sort of the digital weeds team and what they've been up to. Part of our success is that we've built strong partnerships in the public sector as well as public-private partnerships. We have collaborations and funding coming from commodity boards. We're collaborating with a number of technology companies and agribusiness, agrochemical, as well as private on-farm research networks. So really rich and growing. And I may not have fully updated this list, so there's could have missed some partners or things that have evolved in the last year. So computer vision and AI from the grow perspective, we're really focused on merging precision agriculture, site-specific solutions with the more sustainable IWM strategies that are available to us, and sort of merge that type of approach so that we can modernize and get broad scale adoption with IWM. A lot of us have been focused on IWM for many years, and I think that we've seen a very slow adoption of these types of practice in the landscape. We see much more IPM adoption from the disease and the entomology side, and the weed side. We've sort of been victims of our own success. But now that we're having more and more resistant biotypes and challenges with some of the chemical control options we have, we're seeing more and more integration of IWM, and growth seeks to sort of help provide that support and information during these transitions. Key focus from the digital weed side is building a national image repository, which I'll explain in greater detail what that is in a second. And then applications of that image repository include sort of performance mapping, like mapping weeds from a density and a biomass perspective. And then we're also looking at some niche applicators, sort of control mechanisms that these computer vision and AI models would feed into. And so there's some examples of some folks doing this work in ARS as well in the back end of this presentation. So some of the state of the science right now, why are we building a national image repository, right? So there's been a lot of work in the last couple of years on really building, high quality image repositories that map the crop. And so, okay, we know exactly which plant out here is the crop, and then everything else is the weed, right? And so that allows us to put these, bounding boxes around everything that's out there. And some of those red boxes are grasses too. So differentiating between grasses and the crop, which is a grass, but still the point here is just it's weed and crop. And there is a lot of win there, right? There's a lot of opportunities, especially in these fallow systems. You see broad adoption. For example, in Australia, you see a lot of momentum in just, maintaining weed-free fields where just see something green, spray something green. But here now what we're distinguishing between is crop and everything else. But we really want to know what are all those plants in there? What are all those species? So this is a bounding box approach, and certainly a pixel-wise annotation allows us to then also get sort of the cover and the distribution of weed versus crop. But again, we want to know what are those species in there, because that has a lot of implications both from a research perspective as well as management for growers. So that's why we're building this high resolution open access image repository. So we're trying to sort of knock out the bulk of weeds in North America, and we're really heavily focused on agronomic weeds right now. And I'll describe sort of our workflow in this image repository. We're taking both a semi-field and a field approach. And we're doing this from weeds at the cotyledon stage all the way up to fairly mature weeds, although we do have some limitations at the very upper end, but we're capturing it as pretty large mature weeds. And we see this as a national resource, right? That this is a public resource that folks in the public sector can innovate and build on this repository and use this for their various applications with robots or research applications. We see the private industry can be building on these solutions. So it's a resource for all. It sort of provides an opportunity for a lot of industry and startups to also scale, because it's really hard to build these image repositories, right? Industry to be able to get all of these weeds and generate the images needed is very hard to do that for the diversity of species out there. Whereas, distributed ARS scientists and land grant university folks can do this well, and over time can build sort of this public good. So here's the semi-field. We're not doing this in the greenhouse. I'm just showing you some visuals of what this will look like outside. We're not doing this in the greenhouse because there's some evidence that growing under glass, the surface conditions of a leaf can affect its the ability to sort of detect what that species is. And I'm not going to go into great detail about that. So it's going to be done in a semi-field. As I mentioned, these extensive image repositories from weeds all the way up to about 45 centimeters tall in the semi-field. So this is just the semi-field, not the full field part of the repository. The first year, so we've been spending the last 2.5 years working out the technology, building this BenchBot, which is this autonomous robotic platform, working out a lot of the data flow, building the infrastructure, testing the cameras and the technology, selecting the cameras. There's been a tremendous several-year effort to build up to this moment. And then this year, in the next couple of weeks, we go live with launching the image repository for 27 species of weeds, some cover crops, and some select cash crops. Yeah. And so here's some visuals, for example, these outside locations where there'll be benches, and the BenchBot robotic platform I described will go across these benches. This is in North Carolina. This is in Texas A&M. This is some of our camera infrastructure. You can see that we're going to be growing the semi-field in pots. I mentioned the target size and some details on the camera. And here's sort of, we're really proud of this BenchBot product. It took third place in an open computer vision competition. It was a North America competition that we took third place in, and sort of the innovation around its use in developing these image repositories. Here's sort of some working on this hardware inside. There's just a little video that we're training this to be fully autonomous, so that it'll go across a bench and continuously collecting images across the entire bench. And both be autonomous in that it's collecting images across the bench. As you can see, the camera moves from side to side, but then we're also training it to be able to track along the bench lengthwise. This is a potent tool for building the image repository, for doing phenotyping in the greenhouse, but it's also a great product just for testing different camera technology and developing camera technologies in various different, applications so that we can prototype it on this autonomous robot. Oh, I think I already played that. So let's walk through the semi-field image repository here and sort of the workflow. This is sort of just an example of sort of early efforts before we've gone live with BenchBot, but you can see here sort of the backdrop would be these like, a black, landscape cloth and black pots and dark soil, so that you can see that strong distinction with the green there. So the camera has the, with an RGB image, we can do structure for motion. So it'll give us a lot of depth information about precisely where every pot and every plant is, where the camera is on every single photo it takes. So that way we can stitch together images and map across the entire bench, know exactly where we are. This helps us kind of track metadata on which pot has which species in each pot. So we're sort of, planting the seeds of every weed species in these pots. So we sort of can automate the annotation of these weeds at the semi-field step, just because we already know what those species are. But then other ways that we're automating this workflow is that we can then, put bounding boxes around these weeds based on sort of their color distinctions. And so you can sort of just put a box all around those weeds. And then from that bounding box, so sort of automating sort of the selection of those weeds, we can then extract those specific images associated with each of those weeds. And then we can apply a pixelized annotation to that. And that allows us to cut out the entire weed. And we're doing that just based on these color differentials. So this is sort of automating, right, this process instead of sort of hand tracing these weeds. So it's huge time saving. And then we can take these weeds and we can impose them on different backgrounds. So you can see here, we can twist them around this cutout. So here's some of the example of that, right? So now we've got all of these weeds that we've cut them out, and we can impose them on different backgrounds, different soil types. We can train them in high residue, low residue systems for folks who are using cover crops. We can put them into tillage-based or no-till systems, sandy soils versus heavy, dark, silt loams and what have you. And then we can superimpose them in all sorts of different densities here. And this allows us to create a set of training images, what we call synthetic training images, to further train their neural nets to be able to have higher precision in the identification of species when they're growing in these different mixtures of other species of weeds and crops. And this is just an example on the right here, sort of what it takes to hand annotate. Super time intensive process. And so we're saving massive amount of hours with our sort of automated approaches versus sort of these manual cutouts. And that is not just huge time savings, but it's also a lot of money. So this sort of enables us to really do the kind of scaling that we're talking about. So now let me introduce sort of where the rubber meets the road on some of the team. So the core team that has this robotic platform is there's folks at Texas A&M. Many of you know Mutu. We have Chris Ruger-Horton and Ramon Leone at NC State, and myself at Beltsville, Maryland. And we're kicking off a number of these weed species per year, as well as some cash crops and cover crops. And every year we'll continue to expand that repository from the semi-field perspective. And that's where folks around the country will be shipping us seeds to be able to build out that repository. We certainly can't do the same step for the field where you need those naturalized populations, and that's where sort of other members in the Grow network participate. And then this Weeds 3D, where we can developing a tool for density and biomass mapping. You can see those folks are sort of the users of the technology and some of the calibrators. So the red and the orange box states are both helping with the calibration of technology as well as the deployment in our different experiments and such. So here's a little look at the field image repository now. So you can see we're sort of really putting in the extra effort to still put sort of these backgrounds of these mats around weeds, just kind of, throttle the weeds so that we can sort of still automate the annotation process, get the highest quality images and not have to, separate it out from all the other plants that are out there. And so here's an example of what that's going to look like. And sort of the rollout and the scale of this that you can see here on the left, and using the same camera system, but slightly different flash technologies, as you can imagine, for the field. All of these sites, all participants are using the exact same camera technology. It's really important that we're developing very high resolution image repositories. And you can see here sort of this, what we're doing in the field with that monopod. You can see that monopod right here, this long pole. Basically, just from moving it 4 times across as we walk across that around that weed, we shift the angle of that camera. So we're making sure we're getting multiple angles and viewing angles of these weeds as we build this image repository. Very important for training the neural nets, as well as sort of having a diverse image repository that can serve different use cases. Some folks are just using cameras in nadir mode. Others are going to have an angle. We want to be able to serve up those different applications. So that was the 2D image repository and everything associated with it. I'm just giving a quick little shout out to Mutu's lab at Texas A&M, who's helping to lead sort of this effort and bring this to our team as for also looking at a true 3-dimensional approach to developing an image repository. It's in the early stages, but it's a really exciting pipeline that could potentially become a larger part of our future. And so just want to give a shout out to that effort. It's a big effort, and Cheng Sung is sort of leading that effort in Mutu's lab. So, okay, so now applications for the image repository. Everything I presented right now is sort of like, how do you build an image repository so that you can train a neural net to say, is that a pigweed? Is that a foxtail? Is that a corn plant, right? What is the species out there? That's the sole purpose of this image repository. But there are now lots of applications for an image repository. We can use an image repository to quantify weed densities, for example, like you see in this image. We can use it to map fecundities. This is another effort by Matthew Tegata, who's a graduate student at Texas A&M, who's quantifying fecundity of weeds. We can also use this for biomass mapping. So this is sort of that using structure for motion to do a 3D reconstruction of that plant so that you can then get these point clouds to estimate volume. And then we can be using this for quantifying biocontrol, which I'll give a brief slide on that in a bit by an area scientist. Inform drone applicators for precision spraying, and then certainly, oh, here's the drone that you can see in sort of point spraying. And then, this is sort of some of the future precision technologies for really, variable rate, and localized applications for individual weeds in a field, and a whole range of different robotic applications. So to sort of serve up these use cases, these various different applications, the way that workflow begins is that you take these very high resolution images that we've created under a set number of parameters for the color parameters of the camera, the high resolution quality of the camera, and then you degrade those images and you set them to sort of the color scheme characteristics of any one camera that is going to be using that image repository for a given application. And I'm going to talk about this GoPro application now, but sort of wanting you to understand sort of how the image repository then serves a given use case. So the image repository is helping for the species identification. And in this case, we're using the GoPro for both research plot scale, as well as, to mount to tractors to map the biomass of weeds and cover crops and cash crops. So here we're using this for, standardizing research across a network, and you can see these tablets. So in real time, you can be monitoring what you're doing. You can walk across your research plots and then map using the image repository for identifying the species, and then structure for motion for estimating biomass. And this is sort of what this workflow looks like. Let's sort of walk through this. We've got this GoPro camera that's collecting the video. We then dissect several frames because, video is just a series of images stitched together. We select specific frames. In this case, we put this pole and a ball there because that gives us a known dimension that we can, calibrate our images and the depth information. And so then you get this 3D point cloud of this transect that you walk across that plot. And this is sort of how you get your, we start to go down that biomass estimation, and all of this stuff in the middle, just sort of ignore this. This is sort of our steps for the calibration team. We have a whole team of folks across the country that are calibrating this technology. And so this is sort of this calibration step. Simultaneously, we have the image repository that's feeding into the semantic segmentation part of this, right? So we have images of these plots, and those images are then being stitched together, and then we apply that neural net to then appropriate what are the species in that strip, and then we combine the species map to the biomass or the depth map, and that allows us to get sort of an estimation of both the species and the biomass that's out there. And this is just a more simpler. I was going to give this slide, not the other one. I forgot to delete the other one. This is really the workflow for sort of broad users. Here's just an example of what this looks like. For the training, we set a metronome. Can you hear that? To help sort of standardize the pace. Obviously on tractors, you're not going to need to do that. But this just sort of gives you a sense of what it looks like to take these videos. And really the bounce also with the footsteps is an important part of this workflow to calibrate against. Now I want to just introduce another technology because we're really excited about the application of this camera system. And I think this is sort of a big part of our future. This is sort of doing the same thing, but in a different approach. Before we were using structure for motion, which is very compute intensive. It requires a lot of computational capacity. It's not something that you can really do in real time. It's very expensive to do it in the cloud. And so it really kind of requires that downloading of those videos and processing it not in the field. Whereas this is including an RGB camera in the center here, just a single RGB camera. And that's what we use for our species identification. That's how we develop that semantic segmentation map of the species that are out there. And then we have stereo cameras that are of a known distance apart, and that's what allows us to get this depth map. And so we sort of on the fly in real time can identify species and build a depth map, which is sort of much faster, much less compute intensive. And it sort of allows us to sort of move the science in this direction where sort of what we see is sort of a lot of industry is going, right? A lot of industry has been using LiDAR historically, and we see more and more with for example, autonomous cars and all sorts of autonomous technologies. More and more they're using these stereo camera capabilities because they have less limitations especially in outside conditions. So we're excited about kind of this approach and moving in that direction. Here's sort of a protocol. And what I really want to highlight here, and this is going to give me an opportunity to jump into infrastructure. This kind of work requires broad teams, large teams, multidisciplinary teams, which requires lots of cyber infrastructure and community of practice. We're developing extensive, Google Docs, that real-time protocols that are updated that everybody have access to. We have these documents we can go right into and see, like, this is the web apps that we're developing. So folks joining this project, if you're a user or a developer, you click on which applies to you. And then this is a way to automate a lot of the metadata that's needed to link to these videos. So just a lot of infrastructure that goes into supporting sort of multidisciplinary teams like this. And all of our workflows, we keep it on GitHub repositories, so it's transparent. Everybody can see exactly the kinds of the work we're doing and how we're approaching our science. All right, now to switch gears, I'm going to give some use case examples of other scientists in ARS that are taking this sort of digital weeds approach to their research. So here some work by Melissa Smith. Here she is working with unmanned aerial vehicles, so UAVs, to take images of rangelands as well as aquatic ecosystems. And what they're doing here is developing the ability with flying at low heights with high resolution cameras. They're being able to do some species level identification and mapping. For the audience here, it's very hard to do species identification from drones. It's not an option from satellites. And for most applications of drones, you really can't get species level identification. But where you don't have high diversity of numbers of species and you're flying really low and have high resolution cameras, you can start to map out those species. And here then they're being able to sort of map these in aquatic ecosystems and rangelands. And they're also able to track their biocontrol practices. So they're deploying biocontrol practices out there. And then through these workflows, they're able to map how much herbivory is happening, how much of those herbivores are impacting these invasive weeds. So really sort of exciting applications here for invasive weed management. Here's another example, ARS scientist Daniel Martin at Texas A&M, who's collaborating with Mutu Bagafatinianen, who I mentioned earlier. Here's where they're doing spot spraying of on turf grass, in golf courses in this application here with these types of applicators. And you can sort of see on the right here, this untreated plot here where the weed has not been controlled. And you can see just from backpack spraying on versus using this, drone technology, this image-based system here, you can see that they're able to target the weed from the image-based system and it automatically goes and sprays that weed. You can see high degree of efficacy. Here's just another visual of this. You can see Dan in the photo here. And this is some applications in some field crops. You can sort of see the same here, targeting some resistant weeds in the field. And you can see here that the untreated versus the backpacked or the remote piloted aerial application system. So important to differentiate that, between drones that I mentioned earlier. These are automatically able to detect, see, and spray the weeds. And you can see they're able to stop the weeds before they reach maturity. So they're not producing viable weed seeds and sort of impacting the overall seed returns to the system. And this is a really cool video that highlights that. All right. And just some examples of this in a rice field. So sort of more green on green applications, detecting the individual weeds and targeting them and spraying them. So here's another group in Mississippi, Reginald Fletcher and Krishna Reddy. So I'll be presenting some of their work here. Some of their early work with UAVs were sort of mapping, various vegetation indexes and how the yields of the crop were impacted by dicamba spray. So here they're sort of testing the effects of drift injury on soybeans and sort of the rates and how well they can detect this with RGB imaging. And you can see that they have really strong relationships by mapping both the injury on the soybeans using sort of these drone and vegetation indexes. So some of their conclusions: these remote sensing systems are versatile and complement satellite, aircraft, and ground-based systems. They're very effective at ultra low altitudes and provided you're using these high resolution images. And I want to sort of reiterate that it's really hard to do species level identification with drones. And so it does require some accommodations, but you can see they're having some success here. All right, some additional work they're doing with hyperspectral mapping of weeds. So they're training these hyperspectral cameras on various different weed species. And really what they're trying to do is being able to track resistant versus susceptible biotypes. I just think this is the coolest thing here. So they're, let me go back here. So they're training to be able to detect, is this a susceptible biotype? Is it a resistance biotype? And be able to do this here, you can see in a soybean field. And you can see here from these, from their analysis, where they're looking at sort of the ability to differentiate between susceptible and resistant biotypes, that they have a very high prediction accuracy, both in the greenhouse and in the fields, just really high. And then this is sort of the wavelengths across the hyperspectral, these hyperspectral cameras are taking endless number of different bands. And so this is sort of, they've identified sort of the key bands that are for detecting this dynamic, this susceptible versus resistant biotypes. And then they've sort of looked at sort of genetically heterogeneous versus homogeneous or pooled populations out in the field and sort of quantified which wavelengths are sort of the best criteria. You can see it sort of holds up fairly consistently across. So really good work for helping to sort of map out these resistance in the field. All right. And they're expanding this work to include a number of different species. And you can see here that they're developing this hyperspectral systems and scouting capabilities with drones. And I think sort of this key goal of theirs is not just for this mapping and then going in and training these drone systems that can spot spray, but they also want to be able to be mapping in real time, again, as they're going out and doing management. So they're continuously improving the maps and the information of what's going on in the field. So like you've taken a map of what's going on out there, you inform a technology to go out there and provide control, and then be able to continuously map while it's doing that. So it continuously improves the resolution of the information you have in those systems out in the field. So that's sort of the threads that I wanted to capture today and give you some sort of use cases, examples of what we're doing with digital weed management in ARS.
Yeah, thanks, Stephen. That's great. I see we have a number of questions, but before we get to those, I wanted to ask you first, just because you're kind of, at the cutting edge of this whole field of technology and weeds, and so where are we at with adoption? Because it seems like the tools are available to growers perhaps, and probably ag consultants are using these, and I'm sure some industry folks are. So are we kind of at the cusp of we're going to see this explosion of these tools all of a sudden be used, or what's your sense of that before, just kind of from what you've seen, or where are we at with that?
Yeah, that's a great question. I don't necessarily want to suggest that I have a firm finger on that pulse of exactly where we are at from the industry side. I think you're seeing, like right now, we are just seeing a surge in the weed control world, right? Like, I mean, every other week a new robot comes online that can control weeds, right? So this has clearly got the imagination of roboticists, engineers. You've got a lot of folks, certainly in the public sector, but I'm seeing startup companies left and right. So, and in fact, there's a number of startup companies in Europe that have really already have high degree of traction. I think in Europe, particularly, they've sort of been far more receptive to some robotic weed control, and there's been much more adoption. I both think sort of both the interest in sort of non-chemical weed control and just sort of the research community there has been sort of pushing this box forward, really hard and fast. So I think we have a lot of adoption there. I think we're starting to see more and more traction in the US from a range of these different types of technologies and practice. And so I think that what's coming online fast is that the research community is learning how to make this more and more affordable, right? How do we develop low cost systems? And then you saw our example with the image repository, right? That's sort of that proof of concept early development, that it's so expensive for the private sector to do, right? So we're sort of de-risking that solution, right? Think about all the university salaries and ARS sciences salaries that are all collectively going into sort of populating this image repository. So that's slow and tedious work. But once you have a resource like that, to be able to build and innovate on that and use sort of the camera systems that are coming online are getting lower and lower in cost, and the data flow systems are getting better and better. So I think that we're sort of at that precipice that, if you build it, they will come kind of a thing. And so we're certainly optimistic that the release of the image repository will have a pretty big impact on that. But I think we're already starting to see, a lot of use cases. I think where I see the most traction right now in the US is cotton.
Yeah, and it seems like there's a real need for it. There's these specific applications where it's fitting what the needs are. So I think that's really exciting to see. So I want to get to some of these questions. I don't know, Stephen, if you can see any of these, but I'm going to start in the chat because I've got one right here at the top this is from Michelle. She says, any thought on the likelihood that with the visual repository and digital detection of weeds, that the next natural step in evolution for weeds would be visual mimicry to trick robots, like the Viceroy monarch did to trick birds? So.
Well, I think everybody in weed science knows that weeds find a way. They always find a way, right? There's the amount of selection pressure we're putting out in the landscape is tremendous, and so weeds always find a way. And we've sort of been always playing this cat and mouse game with them, and sometimes we're winning that battle, and sometimes we take a couple of hits and take a couple steps backwards. And so I can't really say how this is going to play out. What's being suggested at high likelihood? Sure. How quickly that comes online, it's hard to tell. And I think that sort of one of the great advantages is that these computer vision and AI applications is not one tactic. They really drive chemical controls, they drive mechanical controls. There's a whole range, it precipitates a range of cultural management strategies that historically were not available as well. So the tools in the tool belt are growing as far as the non-chemical control strategies. And I think that's going to help keep the weeds guessing for a while.
Yeah. And I also think, just taking a picture, you're not putting pressure on, you're not actively, doing something where it's going to have to evolve or adapt. I think then when we make our applications, then you're going to see that, but taking picture, probably not. But that leads to the next question by Amanda. She says, there's maybe more of the issue of confusing weeds versus the crop. So, your work on distinguishing the weed from the crop, is that a real challenge? And kind of, what are the trade-offs between mistaking crops sometimes versus missing weeds?
I guess the short answer is the technology can do it, right? So that's not in question anymore, right? The technology capabilities of distinguishing between a crop and a weed is there. A part of it is absolutely, on the quality of the image repository, the depth of the amount of images we have. We all know that crops and weeds have high diversity of morphological characteristics based on how they're grown, where they're grown. So climates and soil and management sort of drive those morphological characteristics. So the short answer is that we need lots of data, right? This is a very you need a lot of images to train good neural nets to really have that consistent performance, but we're already showing very high precision and very high levels of consistency. And the deeper we go with the image repositories and the more training we can provide, the better this is going to get. And I'm not overly concerned about that.
Yeah, and they've been working on that for quite a while. So I think that's, and that's actually what the technology is specific for, is the differentiating between, different organisms. We've got a question about aquatic species, and this is probably related to Melissa's work on UAV. Any spot application, for aquatic species using UAVs? I know of some, but I don't know how extensive it is, and maybe you could touch on that a bit.
If Melissa is on the call, she could chime in, right?
Yeah.
Is she here? Melissa, I think I see you on the participant list.
Maybe, Melissa, if you answer that in the chat, I see that might be the best way to do that. Let's keep going here. Someone wants to know about any notable open source code examples behind the heuristics employed by some of these solutions, especially in drone delivered solutions. Is that I think you talked about open source, so you've got your what you're doing is open source. Is that code available as well?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, everything that we produce are going to be open source, open access resources. So, I mean, we are building out these repositories in an open ecosystem. We're going to be, providing all of the documentation, and it will be a public resource for sure. Yeah.
I'm going to move over to the Q&A. We've got someone that wants to know, so you talked about the Grow Network. Is that, are you taking additional, partners? Are you open to having, other researchers maybe join you? It's anonymous, I don't know who, but is that something that you're welcoming as well?
Absolutely. I mean, this is a public good, Grow, and obviously I'm thrilled that ARS was able to sort of help establish Grow through area-wide funds in 2014-15 is sort of where it kicked off, and ARS is providing an additional 6 years of funding, so it sort of got like 12 years or so of support coming from ARS. But Grow is a very distributed network. There's many leaders across Grow that are university, ARS, and they have elevated Grow in many unique ways to sort of sustain and sort of expand what is possible, and includes lots of public-private partnerships, as I mentioned earlier. So we're really a very open and inclusive group, and really are always looking to find new members. I mean, obviously, part of partnership comes from where any one resource comes from and how we expand any one activity. So, the way Grow is sort of, we have, sort of an a la carte relationship, particularly from the research perspective, right? Some research questions come up, folks want to collaborate on something. Some folks will go after a grant. You might have 8 or 10 people go after one grant. You might have 30 go after the other. It just depends on the grant programs. It depends on the resources and the projects. And so we're very inclusive in that regard. And then when it comes to I should give a shout out for the workflow for the field image repository. I mean, this is going to be incredibly challenging beast, right? The semi-field, no problem. 3 locations, robotic platform, we'll be able to knock out all that semi-field weeds, in a number of years. It's all the field that's, you really have to have these naturalized populations in your fields to be able to help build those repositories. So each year in the coming years, we're really looking for partners who want to participate in helping to build out the field image repository for species that are important to them and their cropping systems.
Yeah, so I would encourage you, anyone that's viewing this, even if it's recorded, reach out to Stephen or myself. I can connect you as well. We've got a question on this machine learning technology from Mike is asking about, is it honed to identify weed seeds? Is there any work in that way, or do you know about any of that effort that's going on?
I'm not sure I'm aware of if there's anybody in the Grow network has started that. Mutu usually does everything, so maybe Mutu will put a message in the text box here that he's working on that too. But not as of now have we tackled that. Like I said, I did present a slide from his lab on some fecundity work, trying to estimate fecundity. But there is a group, Ian Burke in the Pacific Northwest, that is starting to tackle building image repositories around weed seeds. And I believe that Lauren Lazaro started some workflow regarding that in Louisiana, but I'm not positive. So if any of those folks are on the chat line, please message them.
Yeah, we have another question from Marty Williams asking about the hyperspectral camera. So I'm just going to go out on a limb here, Marty, and say probably the folks to talk to would be Dr. Fletcher and Dr. Krishna Reddy there at Mississippi, because I think Stephen, you highlighted their work that's really kind of at the edge of this detecting, resistant populations in the field, and they're really kind of working on that. I'm assuming that's the folks to go to with that kind of a question. He's asking a real specific question.
Yeah, they're certainly doing some really cutting edge work on that. I believe that Prashant in Iowa has done some work or continues to. I'm not fully up to date on all of the work he's doing. And I suspect there are others who are tackling this hyperspectral question.
Yeah, we got a question about the sustainability, and specifically how does weather affect it? So can you go use this in the pouring rain, or when it's windy and gusting wind? I mean, are there limitations as far as how you can use the technology in the field, or is that kind of an unknown yet? Or what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, well, obviously, one of the great wins here is that you're working with sensors that are deployed to tractors or for researchers or handheld, so you have high degree of flexibility. It's not like you're dealing with satellites that you're hoping for no cloud cover. So you're already sort of having larger windows. One of the reasons we're moving for the, and again, there's a lot of different use cases and applications for an image repository. The image repository is just, high resolution images that have been annotated, right? They can then be applied to lots of different applications. Every application has its own unique set of circumstances, and the models and the neural nets you build are unique to that camera and that technology, right? So we're building sort of this core-based resource. The application we're developing is this biomass estimation tool, what we call sort of Weeds 3D. And in that case, the use of, what we're finding is that at least there's a strong evidence that the reason why part of the industry, sort of like the car industry, is moving away from LiDAR, moving to stereo, is because it does have higher flexibility in different environmental conditions and weather. And so that's part of why we're moving in that direction. Where's that edge? We'll have to start testing our technology in tornadoes, and we'll let you know.
What do they call that? Extreme weather chasers or something? We want to see what the weeds are doing. Okay. Anyway, so, and I think you're answering actually a couple of the other questions about the appearance of a weed at different stages, maybe different. So is that being captured in your repository? The very early germination, the cotyledon, all the way up to the larger size weeds. You're capturing that as well?
That's right.
Okay.
That's right. We're going all the way from the cotyledon stage up to mature weeds, and then at the younger stages, we have very high density, and we're thinning back the populations over time. So we have like really high numbers of seedlings that really jacks up the number of images per plant. That is slowly declining as the plants get bigger, and as you imagine, as the plants get bigger, the ability to identify it, improves. So we'll have very high quality data set. I mean, image repositories around these young seedlings, but certainly extending to beyond. And for a lot of our interest in sort of weed mapping from a biomass perspective, it's that more mature biomass is the target.
Got another question about expanding this. I mean, you talked a little bit about aquatic systems, and then you showed the, in turf grass, but have you seen this, firsthand, or any other way, like applied to rangelands, natural areas for identifying and mapping weeds on these very large scales? I mean, your experience with that, or what's your kind of perception of that?
I have a narrower experience, and as any good ARS scientist always knows, we avoid speculating beyond our expertise at public venues like this. So, I've seen some of the names of the participants. You have some of the best experts in the country on this call who are far more experienced than I am in that arena, and or more experienced in general. And so, I think that if any of them can chime in, that would be great. I'll sort of give my very quick and dirty response, which is, as I mentioned earlier, species level identification is really hard, right? The characteristics of species really require sort of like this sub-centimeter, sort of millimeter level resolution. And so drones, it's really hard to do that with because of the height. And so what you are seeing is more and more folks doing these really low flight patterns and very high resolution cameras, and they're having some success with species identification. How well is that working on, like, if there's like 5 or 8 species sort of overlapping in the same space? That's a question I have. My impression is that you can sort of get that to work when you have more monocultures or sort of bicultures out there, but getting species level distinction and like very diverse number of species across large landscapes with drones is hard to do. And in general, that's sort of, I think, the lane that we've picked with some of our applications is because, sure, we have satellites. Sure, we have drones. Drones, your satellites are never going to have the resolution we need in this application. And drones are always fighting gravity. Whereas every single farmer is going to have to drive across every square inch of their field, no matter what, whether it's a robot, whether it's a tractor, you're always going to be driving every square inch of that field. And when you're out there driving every square inch of that field, we want cameras on those booms mapping. And so that's sort of the lane we're picking, is we know a camera on a spray boom is going to give us all the information we need. And so that's sort of why we lean into that. That's obviously a very different storyline than what can be done in ranches and rangelands. And so that's why I'm sort of lost.
Yeah. And that's actually good, kind of a reminder that we're going to hit that topic towards the end, our last theme on impacts. So we're going to hear from a number of folks that work in rangeland systems. So I would encourage you guys to attend those. But yeah, I think it's an emerging field as well. I think this technology piece is really something that's, in a way, maybe you're not using it as a researcher, but you're aware of it, and then if you're not, I think there's a lot of collaboration, a lot of opportunity to collaborate with computer scientists, engineers, like we've never seen before. So that's really what the excitement is, I think, and seeing this really being applied in a useful way. I think that's really, cool to have. So I don't know if Melissa's able to come on, but I've asked her to join us because we've got a couple questions on the aquatic area. So if she's able to, otherwise, Stephen, I guess we've got another question. Oh, she's in the chat. So Melissa, if you're in I think that might work best. If you're in the chat, just address questions. And also, can you put your email? So if people want to follow up with you, can you put that in there, and then folks can reach out to you. So last question here, again, kind of around the grow topic, and you kind of, address this a little bit, Stephen, but as far as this collaborative effort between private industry, companies on digital weed management, I think that's one of the hallmarks of grow, is it not? Is where you're not just focusing on the research, but you're also connecting to industry and to partners that are really in some ways outside of the agronomic realm. So is that true essentially?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we're Grow is partnering with a number of equipment companies from the perspective of harvest weed seed control. So we have a number of different equipment companies that are producing sort of technology and hardware that can be used for the harvest weed seed control. And so we have that technology embedded in research stations, as well as sort of, I think, like 16 or 18 farms across the country now we're doing that on farm as well. So we do on farm and on station research. We have a number of private partners who are in the agrochemical space. For example, we're collaborating with Bayer on a number of this harvest weed seed control studies and IWM economics and sort of sustainability targets. We partner with, folks in the technology space, sort of these software and hardware companies that can help us sort of on our innovation, our data engineering pipelines. So yeah, there's sort of broad, rich collaboration, and it's really sort of built at the grassroots level, right? So we have scientists all across GROW who are elevating various different pursuits, and then sort of the coalition of the willing, right? So you have folks who are sort of excited about any one leader in GROW and what they're proposing, and sort of coalescing around those leaders for various different pursuits, and so you have different folks who are bridging those relationships with these public-private partnerships. Does that kind of get at the question? I sort of think I lost track of what the question was.
I think so. Yep, the company industry partnership. I think it's very evident. And if you ask, you can go to the GROW website too. I think you'll find that that's all there as well. So, so we're at the top of the hour, and I know I try to keep these to an hour, and I really appreciate everyone joining us today. This has really been exciting to talk about new technology, and I appreciate Stephen, your willingness to share your work and all the great insight and the great collaborations that you're developing. I'd encourage folks to contact Stephen if you've got follow-up questions. But I just want to give a little plug for next week. So we're going to start into a new theme on mechanisms. And we're to hear about the role of plant physiology in weed crop competition. So put your basic research cap on and start thinking about some of the fundamental aspects of weed management. So again, thanks everyone for coming out. Next week, same time, same place. We'll look forward to seeing you and having more discussion about weed science research at ARS. So thanks again, everybody. Take care.